is that we're always delighted to have an interesting, erudite, wise, amusing speaker. And today I think we will certainly get that. He's certainly accustomed to handing down judgments or the wisdom of Solomon, because our guest today is Sheriff Principal Edward Bowen, otherwise known to most of us as Ted, and of course is your Chancellor's Assessor. Ted is an Edinburgh man through and through. He's educated at Melville College and then at Edinburgh University. Called to the bar in 1970 and has had a very distinguished legal career in both private and in public practice. He was Sheriff in Dundee, and it was while he was there that he became closely associated with higher education because he became a governor of the Dundee Institute of Technology, which later became Abertay University. After that spell, he returned to private practice and resumed his sheriffdom responsibilities when he was appointed some 5 years later as Sheriff Principal of Glasgow and Strathkelvin in 1997. And during this phase of his life, Ted made a number of striking and innovative changes and improvements to the system of law and the courts that we have in this country. So he introduced, for example, the first drugs court in the country and the first court devoted to domestic abuse. In 2005, we were fortunate that he was transferred to Sheriffdom of Lothian and the Borders, where he has been since. But Ted actually doesn't spend very much time in the Sheriff Court because he is constantly in demand as a judge in the Court of Session and the High Court of Judiciary, roles which he's been occupying for the past 13 or 14 years. Ted's also an accomplished golfer. He was captain of Panmure Golf Club and currently a member of the Honourable Company. And Ted was honoured by receiving a Commander of the British Empire in the 2010 New Year's Honours List, a testament to his contributions to public life in this country. So it is with particular pleasure that I invite Ted to address the General Council lunch.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm particularly flattered, if somewhat surprised, to be described as an accomplished golfer. There are some here who might choose to differ, but it's at least an observation which I shall cherish. Now, I'm conscious that 2 years ago this assembly was addressed by Dame Stella Rimington, who gave a fascinating account of her career in the intelligence services, with tales of international intrigue and secret manoeuvring in the highest echelons of power. I spent 6 years of my professional life fining people for doing 56 miles an hour on the Tay Road Bridge, stealing packets of bacon from Littlewoods, and trying to enter football grounds whilst drunk. So to continue the footballing theme, I'm sorry if this is not quite in the same league. Lawyers as a breed are notoriously conservative. One of my predecessors as Sheriff Principal of Glasgow rejoiced in the name of Sir Robert Henry Sherwood Culver. I never met him, but I am told that he had two favourite sayings. One was, the only place a gentleman should be seen watching television is in his gardener's cottage. The other was, a change for the better is a contradiction in terms. I would like to speak a bit about the changes in the Scottish legal landscape over the last 45 years. After graduating from here in 1966, I became an advocate in 1970, and I suspect that the Faculty of Advocates, and indeed the whole ethos of practice in the higher courts in Scotland, had not changed much since the Napoleonic Wars. Advocates were a privileged breed. They were not to be approached by the general public. Although I did not see it, it had, until not long before that, been regarded as improper for even a solicitor to speak directly to an advocate without first approaching his clerk. The practice was well established. A solicitor wearing an appropriate hat would enter Parliament House and proceed to the advocate's clerk's room, where sat 4 characters who I could describe at length, who were responsible for maintaining the diaries of the 120 practising advocates in exchange for a not insignificant percentage of their fees. They could therefore be expected to know where each of the advocates in their own particular stable might be found. So having ascertained that Mr. Cameron Advocate, to pick a name at random, or perhaps not entirely at random because a disproportionately large number of members of that clan seem to become advocates, having ascertained that he was not in court, the clerk would rise from his desk and take his hat from the hat stand, and both clerk and solicitor, duly hatted, would walk 25 paces across the floor of Parliament Hall to the door of the Advocates' Library, where they would be greeted by a member of staff, known, of course, as a servant. They would inquire if Mr. Cameron was available. The servant would go off into the inner sanctum and would return with the great man dressed in wig and gown. Both clerk and solicitor would raise their hats. The fact that Mr. Cameron and the solicitor had both been at university together, had known each other since childhood, or were, for that matter, dating each other's sisters, was of no consequence. There would be a formal introduction and a request for an audience before the clerk departed, and the pair would stroll up and down Parliament Hall in earnest discussion. Now, we were encouraged on entering the profession to maintain this air of mystique and superiority. We were told that we should only travel first class. We were told that in term time we should always be dressed in black jacket, waistcoat and pinstripe trousers. A bowler hat should be worn particularly when ascending or descending the mound, principally for the purpose of raising it to any judge who one might encounter, or to the sheriff principal, who, it was pointed out, was the most important person in his own sheriffdom, unless a member of the royal family happened to be in residence. Above all else, we should not, under any circumstances, discuss our fees. The sordid topic of money was for one's clerk. He determined what you were worth. It would be as reprehensible for an advocate's fee to be too low as it would be for it to be too high. Now, the bar was, as it still is, divided into the junior bar and the senior bar, the latter being those who had taken silk, that has become Queen's Counsel. The junior advocates fell into 3 general categories. There were those destined for great things who had high-class practices, inheritance and trust cases, commercial, important agricultural work being typical of that kind of business. The second category, most of us, appeared mainly in divorce cases because all divorces in Scotland passed through the Court of Session until 1986, and also in what we called reparation, now personal injury cases, for one side or the other. Reparation work varied from serious and rather sad cases to the more trivial tripping and falling. Not long after I was called to the bar, I appeared in a case in which both sides were represented by eminent Queen's Counsel, who shortly after that became equally eminent judges, which involved someone slipping on a patch of urine deposited by the matron's dog in a care home. The third category of counsel comprised those who appeared in criminal cases. Now, to have a criminal practice in those days was regarded as slightly infra-dig. There had been no legal aid in criminal cases until 1963, Before that, there was a thing called the poor roll, which involved advocates representing those charged with serious crime pretty well gratuitously. So criminal work had been generally unremunerated and thus unattractive. And because it involved working closely with the criminal classes, I suppose the inherent snobbery which permeated society and permeated society and was certainly present to some extent in the Faculty of Advocates, also created the attitude that defending alleged criminals was not an occupation for a gentleman. I use, of course, only the male noun in this context. At that time, the prospect of a lady being involved in criminal cases and thus exposed to the foul language, never mind the behaviour, which is prevalent in the criminal courts, was pretty well too much for anyone to contemplate. However, it has to be said that the attitude changed fairly early in the 1970s. Bobby Younger, whose father was a Viscount, and Michael Ancram, whose father was a Marquess, were called to the Scottish Bar just before and just after me. They both practiced criminal law that dealt something of a blow to the ideological foundations of those who thought that such work was the province of the socially inferior. Now, whilst much work was done in and around the Court of Session and the High Court, there was a certain amount of work in the sheriff courts throughout Scotland, serious road traffic cases and cases involving the use of property, and that sort of thing. It has to be said that the sheriffs of Scotland at that time were a pretty mixed bunch. They were nearly all former advocates. In broad terms, people became sheriffs in some cases at a relatively young age for one of two reasons. Either they were reasonably successful in practice but felt drawn to judicial work and a more stable and less pressurised career appealed to them, or they were not at all successful and needed a job. Those who fell into the first category were almost invariably courteous and efficient. Those who fell into the second category were predictable only to the extent that their judgments were unpredictable. They displayed remarkable deficiencies of character ranging from ill temper to total disinterest. Some were full of their own importance, others were almost invisible. 3 of them were removed from office in the 1970s. One insisted in engaging in an obscure form of political campaigning, despite being warned that this was inappropriate for the holder of judicial office. Another took to lurking around pedestrian crossings, jumping out in front of cars and having the drivers prosecuted in his own court if they didn't stop fast enough. And the misdemeanours of the third would, in the words of the psychiatrist who observed Basil Fawlty, have provided enough material for an entire conference. Now, I mentioned the 3 areas of work where junior counsel practiced, and I suppose I should say that there was a 4th category, those who had no work at all, or at any rate very little. It was almost a tradition of the bar, even more in England, I think, than in Scotland, that someone newly called to the bar could go for a long time without any work, unless they had strong legal connections. There was not too much of that in my early days because most people had spent time in a solicitor's office and that provided some connection. But some did appear unable to establish much of a practice. The reasons are not too easy to articulate. Some people, no matter how well qualified academically, are not cut out for advocacy. Some seem to lack an ability to absorb information and present it clearly by the spoken word. Others have a difficulty in the formal setting of a courtroom to relate to those around them and in consequence give the appearance of being somewhat out of touch. It can happen very easily. I have heard a new advocate call a witness who stood in the witness box wearing a stab-proof jacket to which was affixed a small radio, a pair of handcuffs, and a canister of CS gas surmounted with a badge reading police. The question, "What is your occupation?" created that the interrogator was not quite with it. Now, those who had little or no work usually hung around for a year or two and then drifted off to other things, in some cases very successfully. Others waited for an appointment. And here we come to the power, or perhaps patronage, of the Lord Advocate, which was taken for granted and permeated the world of legal practice until devolution and the Human Rights Act caused his powers of appointment to be swept away. I said at the outset that I suspected that little had changed in legal practice from the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and the powers of the Lord Advocate, in fact, predate that time. It is recorded by Professor Tom Devine, amongst others, that the senior law officers effectively ran Scotland in the latter part of the 18th century. So, until the end of the 20th century, the Lord Advocate, in effect, controlled the appointment of judges and sheriffs, nominated chairmen and members of various tribunals and boards, and appointed his own deputies, known as Advocates Depute, to prosecute in the High Court. One of the jobs which came within the gift of the Lord Advocate was that of becoming standing junior counsel to a government department, which meant that the department in question had to direct any business which they had to the standing junior nominated for that department. After about 7 years at the bar, I was appointed standing junior to the Department for Education. It produced only one piece of work, but it was an interesting one, as it involved resisting unsuccessfully 2 applications to the European Court of Human Rights that resulted in the abolition of corporal punishment in Scottish schools. The applications proceeded on 2 grounds, the first being that the belting of children constituted torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, which is forbidden by Article 3 of the Human Rights Convention, and that argument was rejected. The second ground was rather more subtle. There is a protocol to the Convention which provides that in relation to any functions which it assumes in relation to education, the state shall respect the right of parents to ensure such education is in conformity with their religious and philosophical convictions. The parents in the 2 cases said that they held the philosophical conviction that their children should not be beaten, at least by anyone other than them. Much time and argument was spent over whether such a view was comparable to a religion and was truly a philosophical conviction. But the Human Rights Court held that it was, and there ended centuries of belting in Scotland, caning in England, and in the Isle of Man, birching, and the world for children, if not for teachers, became a happier place. There was, I should add, fleeting consideration to implementing this decision by dividing classes into those whose parents held this philosophy and those who did not. In other words, a class consisting of the beatable and the unbeatable. Personally, I thought that this was absurd, and it was not an idea that was considered for long. Now, there's also an interesting question as to whether the decision was truly on a question of law or whether it was an early example of the Court of Human Rights giving effect to social policy. There's no doubt that the United Kingdom was out of step with the rest of Europe. Many countries never had corporal punishment of children, and others had abolished it ages ago, so the decision of the court brought us into line. But rules which result in social change are a matter for Parliament. Parliament is elected and answerable to the people. The European Human Rights Court is answerable to no one. It is now an increasingly live issue in the light of some recent decisions of the Human Rights Court, for example, in relation to prisoners' voting rights, just whether it is constitutionally acceptable to have an unelected court exerting the power which it does. do not expect an early resolution of the problems in this area. Now, if any of you happen to think that the abolition of corporal punishment was a national disaster, don't blame me. I was led by Senior Counsel James Mackay, QC, in the proceedings before the Commission. And before the case actually reached the Human Rights Court, he had become Lord Mackay of Clashfern, the Lord Advocate, and had asked me to become one of his advocate deputies. I enjoyed that experience immensely, although at first it was quite challenging. It was well recognised that a new advocate depute would start by appearing on circuit in Glasgow High Court. On a Thursday afternoon, you would attend at Crown Office, where you were presented with a bundle of perhaps 10 cases. These would range from murders to serious assaults and rapes, and were scheduled to be dealt with in 3 weeks. You had to be ready to start one case the next Monday, but should have prepared 2 others fully in case the first or second could not start. Judges in those days came onto the bench on the first day to the sound of trumpets. They were totally intolerant of the notion that their time should be wasted. The advocate depute was expected to have a case ready to proceed with another waiting to follow. If defence counsel was held up in another case and couldn't start, the accused solicitor had to find a replacement at short notice. And the cases themselves went through with remarkable speed. I think that my shortest was an attempted murder trial where the accused was represented by Lionel Dykes, QC. Lionel never wasted a word. We started the case at 10 o'clock and had finished the evidence and both speeches to the jury by 12:45. Lionel was particularly keen on a good lunch, and he, more than anyone, was disappointed when the judge announced that he wasn't going to conclude the proceedings until 2 o'clock. Now, most of the cases involved crimes of violence. The big ones were the Glasgow gang fights, gangs of youths armed to the teeth, taunting each other and then exchanging blows which were not infrequently fatal. It was often difficult to get at the truth of who did what. There was then a run of homegrown terrorist cases, mainly Ulster Defence Association, and on one occasion a group called the Scottish Republican Socialist League, which was intent on all manner of mayhem. Fortunately, these groups were institutionally incompetent. The Republican Socialist League intended to place a bomb at the building earmarked to be the Scottish Parliament. When they travelled to Edinburgh, they couldn't find it. So they left an incendiary device at the back door of a Social Security office. One thing I did not encounter was drugs cases, but that was to change dramatically shortly after I left. After 4 years of prosecuting, I was offered an appointment as sheriff at Dundee, and having fairly suddenly become the father of 3 children, I was tempted by the prospect of greater domestic stability. And I found it a strange and rather unsatisfactory job. Whilst it was interesting to be a large fish in a small legal pool, and indeed to have a sort of social standing which I hadn't altogether bargained for, I found it a bit frustrating. There were some interesting cases and some hard decisions to make, but these were few and far between. Most of the work involved low-level crime. I became very familiar with the regulars, those who were in frequent trouble with the law. One man, sadly, wanted to spend his life in prison. He achieved that by stealing packets of bacon from Littlewoods. Whenever he was released from Perth prison, he would get on a bus to Dundee, get off at the stop outside Littlewoods, and lift another packet of bacon. Nothing would stop him. In the city the size of Dundee, there were probably about 40 individuals who caused 80% of the trouble. I am not a particular advocate for the return of transportation to the colonies as a form of punishment, but I can understand the reasons why our predecessors made use of it. So after 6 years, I'd had enough and returned to practice. And then 7 years later, found myself Sheriff Principal of Glasgow with a team of 27 sheriffs and a caseload of 10,000 summary criminal cases alone before we got on to the more serious stuff. I counted myself extremely fortunate to have held office as Sheriff Principal for 14 years. It is a unique and curious position with its origins rooted to some extent to the time when the Lord Advocate ran the country and the next important people were the sheriffs. And that explains why the Sheriff's Principal, along with the Lord Advocate and Solicitor General, are commissioners of northern lighthouses. The construction of lighthouses, it was a serious business towards the end of the 18th century, and it was to be expected that the people who were running the country would be responsible for them. No one has got round to changing that. And because of the historical development of the office, a modern Sheriff Principal has duties which are judicial, administrative, and ceremonial. The judicial duty is to hear appeals from decisions of the sheriffs in civil cases. The administrative work, which takes up a high percentage of the time, is concerned in making sure that the workload in the sheriffdom is dealt with efficiently. The ceremonial duties vary from sheriffdom to sheriffdom. Basically, one is expected to turn out to meet members of the royal family when they visit, but in practice that tends to be reserved for visits by Her Majesty the Queen only. I remember resisting an invitation when in Glasgow to attend the opening of a sewage treatment works by the Duke of York. When I became Sheriff Principal of Glasgow, my immediate predecessor gave me one memorable piece of advice. He said, "This is a proletarian city. Do not wear your bowler hat when travelling by bus." So things had gone full circle from being told to wear one to being specifically told not to. But I thought it was a symbolic observation because it reflected the change in society in the last quarter of the 20th century. And indeed, the legal landscape has changed with it. There are now 460 practicing advocates competing for business in some areas with solicitor advocates. The population of Scotland has not trebled, so where has all the work come from? Well, the fact is that the law has become vastly more complex than it was. To pick a few examples, employment law barely existed as an identifiable subject when I started, and more rarefied subjects such as environmental law and the law of intellectual property have become growth areas. Needless to say, human rights issues encroach not only into obvious areas such as immigration, but into planning law and judicial review and many others. When the Human Rights Act came into effect in the United Kingdom, the Lord Chancellor of the day, Derry Irvine, better remembered for his choice of wallpaper, remarked that this was a great day for British justice. However that may be, it was certainly a great day for human rights lawyers. Of necessity, every lawyer, be he a solicitor or an advocate, is a specialist. When I was Sheriff Principal of Glasgow, it was apparent to me that the court structure had to go some way to meeting the expectations of a specialised profession. So I set up specialised commercial and family courts with sheriffs who had some expertise in those areas. This was well received by the legal profession, and indeed it has attracted people to become sheriffs when there is a prospect of practicing in an area with which they are familiar. There is a major structural change about to take place in the Scottish courts. The general intention is that sheriffs will handle a higher level of business, and that, in particular, there will be a specialist personal injury court based in Edinburgh Sheriff Court. A new judicial figure, a summary sheriff, will deal with the sort of cases which drove me to distraction in Dundee. Many more advocates now specialise in criminal work. The volume of that has increased dramatically. When I started as an advocate in 1979, it was generally thought that it would occupy about a quarter of your professional time. When I finished 4 years later, it had increased to about a half, but within a short space of time, advocate deputies became virtually full-time. There was, as we're perhaps all aware, an explosion in the volume of criminal cases in the 1980s and 90s, and that trend has continued. To pick one figure, between 1988 and 2008, the number of people indicted, that's to say for serious crimes in the Sheriff Court alone, increased from just over 3,000 to just over 8,000. There is no one single factor. Dealing and misusing drugs is a predominant cause, but I suspect that cheaper alcohol and longer licensing hours come into it. The collapse of heavy industry in the west of Scotland in particular, with the resultant unemployment and poverty, may also have played a part. And there's now more reported crime, and I use the word reported deliberately. An additional heavy burden of cases began to appear some years ago in the shape of what are termed historic sex abuse cases. The sensational ones, and there are a few of these, are only the tip of an iceberg. Most of them, regrettably, involve activities within families which probably went on for centuries but never saw the light of day. And cases of all categories now take much longer. Technology has much to do with this. CCTV evidence, analysis of mobile phones, and DNA evidence now feature in a very high percentage of criminal cases, and it all takes time. There's also a tendency for counsel to go on at much greater length. I don't know what's caused this, but I do know that the older generation of judges simply would not have allowed it to happen. But on the other hand, the sort of pressure which we were under to drive cases through was a symptom of a more authoritarian age and would not now be regarded as fair to anyone. And lastly, and I finish on both a topical and perhaps controversial note, is the change in the role of the Lord Advocate. From the all-powerful figure who we look to for our advancement, he is simply the Chief Prosecutor. Prior to devolution, the Lord Advocate and Solicitor General were political appointees. They acted as legal advisors to the government, as well as having an overall responsibility for the prosecution of crime. They were usually people with some breadth of legal background with an affiliation to the party in power. They were politically accountable, that is to say, directly answerable to Parliament for the actions of their department in the same way as any other government minister. For no particularly obvious reason, both positions are now held by career procurators fiscal, and questions have been raised quite properly, in my view, as to whether they have the appropriate level of accountability and whether their legal background is too restricted to provide the type of advice which a chief legal advisor should be expected to give. These are interesting questions which some might say raise academic questions of constitutional law, but in my view one can see a practical manifestation in the current debate about the law of corroboration, that supposed quirk of Scots law which requires proof of a crime and the identity of the perpetrator to be established by evidence from more than one source. Whatever view one takes of it, and for my own part, I consider that there is some doubt as to how useful a requirement it is in modern practice. There can be little doubt that the approach to a radical change in the law has not been well handled, and it is hard to see why the issue is one which should cause a division of opinion along party political lines. I do wonder whether a Lord Advocate who was not a career prosecutor would at the very least have encouraged the government to approach this issue with a greater degree of circumspection. Now, I sometimes ask myself if things have got better since I set out in the law, but in truth, the question is irrelevant. Old men will always think that things ain't what they used to be. The inescapable fact is that society changes, and lawyers have to change their attitudes to react to those changes. Sometimes we react too slowly. It was in 1960, which to some may seem like yesterday, that the Attorney General asked the jury in the case of the Queen against Penguin Books whether Lady Chatterley's Lover was the sort of book you would allow your wife or servants to read. Even then, people thought it was ridiculous. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this lunch always has the atmosphere of a family party, but particularly on this occasion, because our guest of honour is our very own Ted Bowen, Chancellor's Assessor. He's given us a wonderful, fascinating insight into the world of law, and he's done it in a way with his characteristic dry sense of humour. We know much more about the law, particularly from the viewpoint of a sheriff principal, so much so where he's blinded us with science and into speechlessness. But it's hardly surprising that although he's retired as sheriff principal, he still sits in the High Court as a judge all around the country. Now, Ted is a man of many parts. He has many interests. One is the countryside. He lives in Angus, so I suppose you must love the countryside if you live in Angus. Only joking, Ted. We've heard also that being a sheriff principal, he's been a commissioner of the Northern Lighthouse, and whenever you see the Chancellor, Princess Anne, and the Chancellor's Assessor in deep conversation, it will obviously be about lighthouses around Scotland. We've heard also that he's an accomplished golfer. Well, he's a member of 2 links courses, Panmure near Carnoustie, and another famous, rather infamous club in East Lothian, which is single sex. He describes his golf as of limited ability, but that's not my experience, because there's 2 sides of Ted. There's Ted, the high-powered, eminent lawyer, sheriff principal, judge, and the other side is the noted golf bandit. He is highly competitive and very difficult to beat. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Ted for a wonderful speech.